unconditionally valid. It's not true that capital unconditionally increases labor productivity, despite the claims of its ideologues that it does so. For capital, this productivity is not raised simply because more living labor in general is spared than is added in past labor, but only if more of the paid part of living labor is spared. The Lawrence and Wishart translation of this I find a bit more helpful, and the verb changed is saved, but basically saying it greater productivity, technically, more advanced or more productive way of doing things is not necessarily adopted by capitalism. It's only adopted if it replaces the paid, if its cost replaces the paid part of living labor. So if the paid part of living labor is less, then it's less likely that the greater productive arrangement will be adopted. That's the sort of point that comes out of it. These are the final words of this part 3 of volume 3. And I'm saying this because of some critics who later put this in doubt. I have no doubt whatsoever that Marx's theory of declining rate of profit is leading to his theory of crisis. It's the basis of his theory of crisis. It's not yet the finished theory, but it's the core of the theory. And so what he concludes, the very last two words of this whole discussion are hence crises. Now some observations from me before I move on to the next section. Very quickly, I can see I'm already time challenged. Basically, this is an extension of the general law of accumulation, but it's a rerun of it, this time vectored through profitability. Everything's about profitability. And what this does is it gives his explanation of the historical limitations of the capitalist mode of production. It's now based on an internal contradiction. It's not, everything that's born must die type argument. He's showing that internally capitalism will drive itself to crisis. The form of the crisis he hasn't really yet explained. That comes later in volume 3, right? But to be absolutely clear about this point, capitalism sets its own limits, and that limit is profitability. At a certain point in capital's accumulation, investing more will not create more profits, will not create more surplus value. And when that happens, you have a crisis. It's very obvious that this text is a draft, but it has got some really core essential points contained within it, which do explain a whole range of phenomena. They explain the connection between a whole range of phenomena at a systemic level. I think the criticisms of Engels' editorship are very, I think they're quibbles, basically. I think they're quite minor compared to the intellectual achievement which his editing brought to the world. And I think also it was wrong by Marx. And the much bigger point is Marx's decision to exclude theoretically at this level of analysis the operation of counteracting tendencies. I mean, I think this is the big picture story. My critique, or this critique of Marx, our critique of Marx on this point is different to what I would call the standard critique. You might call it the Eurocentric critique, right? And this came up in literature much more in the 1970s, and it's not such a live debate today, but it's a sort of intellectual framework which certainly I inherited. And the main critique of Marx's theory is that has been that it's just an empirical question whether increased technical composition does in fact lead to increased value composition. In other words, there's no inherent tendency for organic composition of capital to rise because the labor which is producing machines itself is more productive. Therefore, the machines that make machines can become cheaper. So what this does is it removes any sense of logical necessity to a rising organic composition of capital, and hence tendency to decline in the rate of profit. It becomes very much an empirical question rather than the sort of inherent limits of the capitalist mode of production. What this approach misses, in my view, is, and I do think there's either explicitly or implicitly a Eurocentrism to it. What it misses is it concentrates on the machinery, and it doesn't take into account, in actual fact, a much bigger component of the rise in the value composition, the organic composition, is due to the increased volume of raw materials. And so circulating capital, as labour becomes more productive, as more cotton is turned into thread and thread into yarn and so on, massive increase in the amount of throughput of the raw material. So the raw material side is completely underplayed in if you like, the standard critique of Marxist theory. Yes, there's an obsession with technology. We need to look at the raw materials chain. Going back to, if you remember the diagram, we not only look at the sort of like the top line of industrial production, we need to look at the industrial production of the supply chains to those industries. Now, what I'm going to do now, we can take a slight pause if you want. There's a lot to concentrate on. That's the end of the first main thing I want to talk about. And I'm now opening up the second big topic I want to talk about, where I want to start arguing the direction of a solution to these issues. And the way I'm approaching this in the first instance is I want to try to bring in both variables, which is the rising organic composition of capital and the variation in degrees of surplus value. So pretty much close to Marx's framework. I'm just sort of tweaking it, if you like. It's not a fundamental critique by any means. It's a use of his framework, but bringing in further variations within it. So the way I do this is to look at two countries or two cases, A and B, which for the time being, we're going to say operate as two distinct value regimes. Okay, which in other words, there's two totalities. There's not one unified totality yet. There are two distinct total social capitals. And I'm going to do this by stepping them through 3 time periods. And then what I'm then going to do is to look at each of those two value regimes and disaggregate them to take into account different rates of surplus value. So the idea here is that rate of surplus value is a principal distinction as well as the organic composition of capital. So I'm not getting rid of the organic composition of capital. I'm looking at its interplay with a rising rate of surplus value. Now, what this entails is, this is also a methodological point, but one you might want to ponder. I mean, one gets accustomed to thinking that given the order of exposition, there's a causality. But in actual fact, certainly in these first 3 parts of volume 3, what Marx is doing, he has to present it linearly, but these are sort of interacting levels of the same reality. So, I mean, there are good reasons for his sequence of introduction, but there's also possible to reverse the sequence or to play around with the sequence in order to bring out certain points. And that's exactly what I want to do. I want to start off with declining rate of profit, and then I'm going to come back to the question of prices of production. So this is the first case. The starting point in period 1 is an absolutely, if you like, bog standard example which Marx gives time and time again. We have a capital which is split between ATC and 20V, constant and variable, a rate of exploitation in terms of surplus value of 100% will generate a rate of profit of 20%. That's 20 over 100. And then what I hypothesize, if you like, is in the accumulation of capital, so that in the next period, there's a total of 200 capital being advanced, and this is between 185C and 15V, 200. The surplus value is now 25. Rate of profit has actually gone down, even though the surplus value and the rate of surplus value has gone up. And in period 3, we have a total of 400. These components you might find quite interesting, how much C there is compared to V. 39:1, that ratio, an S over V of 300%, rate of profit of 7.5%. So these are not separate variables. They're a set of related internal relations, okay? So as the mass of capital increases, we've gone from 100 to 200 to 400, doubling each time. The mass of surplus value is increased, but notice not so quickly, not so at so steep rate.